Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. As you can see, I'm not in my usual filming spot. I won't be for a little while as I'm out of my house. Anyways, today I'm going to be discussing which is better, SARMs or steroids, and what's my opinion on it. But before we get into that, please remember I have no medical training. I am not a chemist. I am not a doctor, nor do I pretend to be one. I do not encourage the use of any substances, legal or illegal, and this video is strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only. Alright, so are SARMs steroids without the side effects? This is a claim that is often made by people who peddle SARMs. The answer is no. They often have similar effects, but and they might have less side effects, but they do not have no side effects. And they are definitely, I would say, my personal opinion, less powerful than steroids because they do not have as many accesses to affect the body on. They are hard to compare considering recommended dosages are wildly different, and data on SARMs is extremely lacking. So to compare 200 milligrams of testosterone to 15 milligrams of RAD140, I don't know if that's essentially fair, but no one's going to take 200 milligrams of RAD140 because that could be dangerous because there's no efficacy data on someone taking 200 milligrams of RAD140. Overall, anecdotally, people have had great results from both SARMs and steroids and have seen better recoverability and overall better performance. But in SARMs, I have heard anecdotally, people have had better recoverability from their endogenous production of sex hormones. Now, what I mean by this is when they stop cycling with their SARM, their sex hormone production comes back quicker. Now, if you think about this in a logical half-life sense, this makes sense. Simply, well, I guess if you compare it to oral steroids, it wouldn't. But let's say injectable testosterone, you have a half-life of 7 days. You have to wait until there's essentially no testosterone in your system left, which could be as long as 4 weeks or longer. And then your body can start kicking in its natural testosterone production. But with a SARM, you could, maybe its half-life is 1 day. Like I think Austrians is about 1 day. I can't remember off the top of my head. But in about a week, maybe your sex hormone production might start kicking in again because of its shorter half-life. Granted, this doesn't compare to something like a Dianabol. If you're taking a just Dianabol cycle, then, I mean, your sex hormone production would come back faster as well, theoretically, but there's also the question of, do SARMs suppress rather than crash? And it's seen that some SARMs rather suppress than crash, which can aid in a lot of medical things because they won't have to provide estrogen, but it is important to note that in bodybuilder dosages, SARMs will probably crash you. But overall, let's keep going. What most people who venture into enhancement do is they start with SARMs, the weaker ones, in low dosages, and then work their way up to steroids. I don't condone this. To me, it logically makes sense since SARMs typically only interact with one pathway. But I don't know necessarily that there's any sort of safe way to do something when it comes to performance enhancement. I'm just saying what people normally do, and logically speaking, I guess that would make sense. But there's so little efficacy data on SARMs, excluding Ostarine and LGD, that I couldn't say whether besides those two that even in a medical context, you can't really talk about those two very much. I believe steroids to be more conducive for muscle growth and shredding down due to their nitrogen retention, depending on the steroid, obviously, their water retention, and their estrogen increase overall. Obviously, that depends wildly on what steroid it is, as some steroids do not convert into estrogen at all, and some steroids don't have any, or have very little water retention, like Winstrol, which make them overall bad for the joints. I think they overall have more powerful effects on multiple vectors, where SARMs only really impact the androgen receptor. as the name would imply. The name SARM is selective androgen receptor modulator. Selective androgen, meaning it's selective to try and be on the skeletal muscle tissue of the androgen and not impact all of the other receptors to try and get away from the masculizing effects of all of the different steroids, which is great for a medical context. Overall, I think SARMs are extremely promising in the medical field for women and children, but for performance, the only amazing they're only really amazing at covering one vector, which is androgen receptor activation. And even then, there's so much we don't know. For example, like with an S23, we don't know if that's going to impact how much heart growth that can impact. And so to say that it would only impact skeletal muscle androgen tissue and only cause muscle growth in that context would be disingenuous on my part because I don't know that fact. But I also want to talk about something like Tren, which is obviously one of the is the harshest steroid that's not an oral steroid. And Trenbolone, has the unique property of interacting with IGF-1, which IGF-1, for those of you who don't know, is insulin-like growth factor 1. And it has been extremely potent for bodybuilders to use in different forms of injectable for muscle growth. They've claimed they've made it in an oral capsule, IGF-1 straight, but I'm not fully convinced. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But anyway, going back to IGF-1, Tren seems for some reason or another to upregulate its, I believe it's not upregulate, it increases its sensitivity to IGF-1, meaning that the little IGF-1 that your body may naturally produce, or if you use IGF-1 in conjunction with Trenbolone, you might have wild muscle building effects, or you could potentially have great muscle building effects while cutting down, meaning muscle retention effects, because obviously anabolism in a shredding context is more so just muscle retention. Now, this is unique to Trenbolone, but there are a lot of these bizarre, unique effects in steroids that we've noted, but we haven't noted them in SARMs. Now, my opinion overall is which is better in a medical context. 100% SARMs, I would say. They're more promising, but it really depends on the context. If it's a man who has androgenic, who has andropause, or like andropause type symptoms, and they need a replacement, SARMs wouldn't be better in that medical context. It would probably be testosterone replacement therapy that would be much more optimal in that context. But when it comes to maybe a child who needs help recovering from a severe injury, maybe they were in some sort of car accident and they had to get multiple muscles repaired, then I would imagine that SARMs would be extremely useful in that context. Maybe in conjunction with estrogen would be ideal, considering that some people crash with SARMs. And the issue is that SARMs, some people crash on them, and it depends on the dosage. So it can be suppressive, and you can produce a small amount of estrogen, but then again, does that small amount of estrogen actually help to build muscle at that point if it's small? Essentially, there's a rabbit hole you can go down to when it comes to the estrogen part of selective androgen receptor modulators. I've talked about it in the past. If you want to watch my video about SARM idiots, I guess you could say, people who take extreme amounts of SARMs and then don't have any estrogen pathway utilized because they're not going to build muscle. The best they can do is probably hold the muscle that they have, and they can get a lot of severe cardiotoxic and neurotoxic effects. But for example, like I just highlighted Tren's unique effect. I would never suggest Tren in a medical context. I mean, we had it in Tren Hex, the parabolan form, back in the past, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful in that form nowadays. That was more so an experimental idea for women who needed it, postmenopausal women who needed it. And I would imagine that SARMs with a little bit of estrogen would be much more useful for postmenopausal women, or just straight therapeutic replacement of their natural endogenous hormones would be ideal, which is kind of the idea of hormone replacement therapy in general. But overall, which one's probably better for athletes who are trying to do, or I guess you could say, overall, which one would be better for strength athletes where it's like legal to use and things like that? I would imagine steroids would be better, specifically steroids that can have high amounts of nitrogen retention, like if they're in a lifting context, high amounts of nitrogen retention, water retention, and maybe not too high because you don't want to get high blood pressure, and like good estrogen modulation or like higher estrogen, because overall that would increase the amount of muscle that someone could build and the amount of weight someone can lift. But overall, that's my opinion. I mean, SARMs are amazing on the androgen pathway. I'm not trying to knock SARMs. I'm just saying comparatively to steroids, I mean, in a lot of contexts, people say you even have to use steroids to use SARMs because of that lack of estrogen and because of a lot of the lack of other pathways being utilized. But who am I to say? I'm not a doctor. I'm not your doctor. Talk to your doctor. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell, comment down below, share it with your friends, like the video if I didn't already say that. If you're on Rumble, please follow my channel or subscribe to it. I don't know what the button looks like anymore on Rumble. Please hit that Rumble button, comment down below, share it with all your friends, and remember to keep those shoulders back and down when you lift. And until next time, I hope everyone has a good one.